Okay, so we've got this uh, pretty hefty stack of sources here, all about the Civil War,
Yeah,
and I've got to say I'm excited to really dig into this with you.
me too.
We've got excerpts from what looks like a fascinating document called civilwarmaterial.pdf.
Oh, yeah.
And today we're not going to just like rattle off dates and names and all that.
Right.
Instead, let's really try to kind of get into how a nation that was like, founded on this idea of liberty
Yeah.
ends up at war with itself.
Yeah,
It's a pretty wild thought when you think about it.
it really is. It's incredible how, events, even years before the actual fighting began, were already setting the stage for this huge conflict.
Yeah.
Like, let's consider the Mexican War.
Okay.
On the surface, it's a victory for the U.S., right? We gain all this new territory.
Right.
What's not to celebrate?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
New land, new opportunities, manifest destiny, all that. But you know what they say. The devil's in the details.
Oh, absolutely.
The question of whether Texas, one of those new territories, should be admitted as a slave state or a free state, that turned out to be like a massive problem.
Huge.
And this wasn't just about Texas, right? It was about this whole balance of power between the North and the South.
Absolutely. The South saw the potential, of adding another free state
Right.
as like a direct threat to their influence in the federal government.
Right.
And then on top of that, you've got the Wilmot Proviso,
Oh, yeah.
this attempt to just ban slavery in any territory acquired from Mexico. I mean, can you imagine the outrage that caused in the South?
I mean, yeah. It
Yeah.
must have felt like an attack on their entire way of life, their economy, their very identity, really.
Absolutely.
And it's just so fascinating how this fear of losing power, losing influence in the government, like it shapes their reactions to pretty much everything that follows. Even seemingly reasonable ideas like popular sovereignty.
Yeah, popular sovereignty.
Like letting the people in the territories decide.
The idea, at least on the surface, it sounds very democratic, right? Letting the people in the territories decide whether to allow slavery or not.
Right, exactly.
But the South, they saw right through it. They saw the potential for manipulation.
Oh, yeah.
They were afraid that if more Northerners settled in these new territories, they'd be outvoted and slavery would be outlawed everywhere. I mean, the tension was just palpable.
So even before the gold rush, you've got the stage being set, the tension is building,
Yeah.
and then boom, gold is discovered in California.
Right.
Everything gets kicked into like overdrive.
Exactly. California, poised to enter the Union as a free state, applied for statehood much faster than anyone anticipated.
Oh, wow.
It threw another wrench into this already delicate situation,
Yeah.
really sent shockwaves through the nation, and just amplified all the Southern anxieties.
I bet. So, I mean, the South must have just felt like they were completely losing control at this point.
Absolutely.
It's almost as if each event just built on the one before it, just creating this cascade of tensions that ultimately lead to war.
Exactly. You're absolutely right. They demanded concessions, pushing for stronger fugitive slave laws, anything to maintain their standing in the Union. And the threat of secession, well, it wasn't just an abstract concept anymore. It was becoming a very real possibility.
So it's remarkable, right, how something as seemingly unconnected as a gold rush could actually push the nation closer to the brink of war.
Yeah.
But before we actually get to the war itself, let's take a look at what each side brought to the table when the conflict finally did erupt.
Right.
It's almost like setting the stage for a dramatic play, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
You have the North, also known as the Union, dressed in their blue uniforms,
Right.
led by President Abraham Lincoln from their capital in Washington, D.C.
Okay.
They're facing off against the South, the Confederacy, clad in gray, with Jefferson Davis as their president down in Richmond, Virginia.
So Yankees versus rebels. A nation divided against itself. And their strategies were as different as their uniforms, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. The North, with its industrial might and larger population, they employed what was called the Anaconda Plan.
Anaconda Plan.
Yeah, the goal was to essentially squeeze the life out of the Confederacy.
Squeeze the life out of them.
That's a lot of black
That's pretty
terms.
vivid image. How did that work exactly?
Well, the plan had three main components. First, they were going to blockade southern ports,
Okay.
cut off their ability to trade, weaken their economy.
Makes sense.
Second, they aimed to gain control of the Mississippi River,
Uh-huh.
which would effectively split the Confederacy in two.
Gotcha.
And finally, they planned to capture the Confederate capital of Richmond, striking at the heart of their government. So it was a strategic and kind of methodical approach, aiming to slowly but surely crush their opponent.
So the North was playing the long game.
Yes.
Using their resources to just wear down the South. What about the South? What was their strategy?
Well, the South, on the other hand, was banking on what they called total defense.
Total defense.
They knew they were outmatched in terms of resources and manpower. Their hope was to just wear down the North's resolve, make the war so costly that the North would eventually give up and recognize the Confederacy's independence.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
They were fighting on their home turf, defending their families, their way of life. But it also sounds like a risky gamble, going up against such a powerful opponent.
It certainly was. But the South did have some advantages. They had a strong military tradition.
Yeah.
Skilled generals like Robert E. Lee.
Right.
And a population that was, very familiar with firearms and horsemanship.
So in a way, they're relying on their experience and their determination to even the odds.
Exactly. And those advantages were evident in the early battles of the war.
Speaking of battles, let's dive into some of the early clashes and turning points that really shaped the war's trajectory. Were there any that particularly stood out to you?
Well, one that immediately comes to mind is the clash of the ironclads, the Monitor and the Merrimac. This naval battle really revolutionized naval warfare.
It's amazing to think about how technology just changes the face of war.
Totally.
Imagine these massive ironclad ships, unlike anything anyone had ever seen before, just clashing in this brutal display of firepower. What was the significance of this battle?
It marked a turning point in naval warfare. I mean, wooden ships were quickly becoming obsolete, and the race for, bigger, more powerful ironclads was on.
So the Civil War wasn't just about muskets and cannons. It also spurred technological innovation.
Absolutely. And sadly, another early battle stands out for a very different reason. The Battle of Antietam. It was the single bloodiest day in American history, over 22,000 casualties in a single day. It was a brutal reality check for both sides, just a grim reminder of the true cost of war.
It's heartbreaking to even consider the human toll of this conflict. It wasn't just about armies clashing. It was about individual lives lost, families torn apart, a nation grappling with this immense weight of grief.
And the war's impact wasn't just confined to the battlefields either.
Right.
The economies of both the North and the South were drastically affected.
Yeah, I can imagine.
The North, with its industrial capacity, actually experienced a wartime boom.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Factories were churning out weapons and supplies. Farms were working overtime to feed the war machine. It was a period of intense economic activity, driven by the demands of the war effort.
That's fascinating. It's almost counterintuitive to think about a war as being, good for the economy.
Yeah.
But what about the South? How did they fare?
For the South, the war was an economic disaster. Their economy, largely based on agriculture and slave labor, was crippled by the Union blockade.
Right.
They couldn't export their cotton, and essential supplies became scarce.
I see.
And Sherman's march to the sea later in the war further devastated their infrastructure and agricultural lands.
So the North's strategy of squeezing the life out of the South, it sounds like it was working.
Yes. But the war's impact went far beyond just dollars and cents. Life on the home front for both North and South was profoundly affected.
In what ways? What were some of the ways that everyday life was, changed by the war?
Well, think about the roles of women. With so many men away fighting, women had to step up and take on responsibilities that were traditionally held by men.
That's a huge shift in societal norms.
Absolutely. Figures like Clara Barton, who went on to found the American Red Cross.
Oh, wow.
And Elizabeth Blackwell, the first woman to graduate from medical school in the United States.
Wow.
They emerged as symbols of resilience and strength.
It's inspiring to think about how women rose to the challenge, taking on new roles and contributing to the war effort in countless ways. But I imagine there was also a lot of hardship and uncertainty.
There was indeed. There were draft riots in the North, fueled by resentment among those who couldn't afford to pay the $300 commutation fee to avoid military service.
Right.
And in the South, food shortages led to riots and looting as desperation grew. The war touched every aspect of life, creating anxieties and tensions on both sides.
It sounds like the pressure was immense for everyone involved.
Yeah.
What about the leaders themselves? How did they navigate the challenges of wartime leadership?
Well, leadership played a crucial role in shaping the course of the war. Lincoln, for example, faced the daunting task of finding a general who could effectively lead the Union Army.
Yeah.
He eventually settled on Ulysses S. Grant, known for his tenacity and willingness to fight.
Grant's reputation as a fighter certainly preceded him.
Yes.
He eventually became known for his strategy of total war, targeting not just the enemy's armies, but their resources, their infrastructure. It was a brutal but effective approach.
It was. Sherman's March to the Sea, where his troops carved a path of destruction through Georgia.
Right.
That's a prime example of this total war strategy.
Yeah.
It was designed to break the South's will to fight, and it certainly succeeded in that regard.
But it also raises questions about the ethics of war and the long-term consequences of such destructive tactics.
Absolutely. Those are questions that continue to be debated to this day.
Yeah.
But in terms of turning the tide of the war, Grant's appointment as general-in-chief and his relentless pursuit of victory were undeniably key factors.
Right.
He was determined to see the war through to its conclusion, no matter the cost.
So it's clear that Grant's leadership was a turning point for the Union.
Yes.
But what of the South? Were there any key turning points that led to their eventual defeat?
Several can stand out as pivotal moments in the South's decline. The Siege of Vicksburg in 1863 was a major blow.
Vicksburg.
Yeah. Grant's forces captured this strategic city on the Mississippi River, effectively splitting the Confederacy in two and giving the Union control of this vital waterway.
So Vicksburg was a major strategic loss for the Confederacy. Did this loss, demoralize the South?
It certainly dealt a significant blow to their hopes for victory.
Yeah.
And shortly after Vicksburg, another devastating blow came at Gettysburg.
Gettysburg, that small town in Pennsylvania that became the site of one of the most famous battles in American history.
Right.
I remember reading about Pickett's charge, this desperate and ultimately futile assault by Confederate troops against the Union lines. Just horrific losses.
Yeah, Gettysburg was a turning point in the war. Lee's gamble to invade the North ended in disaster. His army suffered heavy casualties. The South was never able to recover from this defeat. And their hopes for foreign recognition and intervention, they dwindled after Gettysburg, leaving them increasingly isolated.
It sounds like the tide was turning.
Yeah.
The South's early victories, their hopes for independence, they were fading as the North's superior resources and determination really started to take their toll.
That's an accurate assessment.
Yeah.
The South fought valiantly, but in the end, they were simply outmatched.
Right.
Their economy was in shambles, their armies were depleted, and their hopes for a swift victory had vanished.
It must have been a difficult realization for the South to see their dreams of independence slipping away.
It was a time of immense hardship and heartbreak for the Confederacy. They had poured their hearts and souls into this fight, and the defeat was a bitter pill to swallow.
So, how did it all end? How did this conflict that had torn the nation apart for 4 long years finally come to a close?
Well, Lee, facing dwindling supplies and overwhelming odds, he made the difficult decision to surrender to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in April 1865.
Appomattox. It must have been such a somber moment. A mix of relief that the bloodshed was finally over, but also a sense of loss and uncertainty about what the future held.
It was a complex moment in history. The war was over, but the process of healing and rebuilding a divided nation was just beginning. And even in surrender, there was a surprising element of grace.
What do you mean by grace?
Grant, recognizing the need for reconciliation, offered generous surrender terms to Lee and his men. He allowed Confederate soldiers to return home with their horses and sidearms.
Oh.
He even provided rations to the starving Confederate army.
That's a remarkable gesture of compassion from Grant.
Yeah.
A sign that he understood the importance of healing the wounds of war and starting the process of bringing the nation back together.
It was a pivotal moment. It set a tone of reconciliation, a message that the war was over and it was time to rebuild.
But I imagine that rebuilding wasn't easy.
No.
The nation had been through so much, and the scars of the war ran deep.
You're absolutely right. The process of reconstruction, the period following the war, was fraught with challenges.
What were some of the key challenges that emerged during Reconstruction?
One of the most significant was the question of how to integrate the formerly enslaved population into American society. Millions of Black Americans were suddenly free.
Right.
But they faced immense obstacles: poverty, lack of education, and widespread discrimination.
That's a huge societal shift, like a monumental task to overcome.
It was, and it was further complicated by the rise of white supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan, who terrorized Black communities and sought to undermine their newfound freedom.
So even though slavery had been abolished, the fight for true equality was far from over.
Exactly. The Civil War may have ended slavery, but the struggle for racial justice was just beginning. It's a struggle that continues in many ways to this day.
That's a sobering thought. And it makes me wonder about the lasting legacy of the Civil War. How did this conflict shape the nation's identity and its future?
The Civil War, despite its tragic cost, ultimately redefined the United States. It ended slavery, it strengthened the power of the federal government, and it laid the groundwork for a more unified nation.
But as you pointed out, the fight for equality and justice didn't end with the war. It continues to be an ongoing struggle.
It does, and it's a reminder that the ideals of liberty and equality, they're not self-executing.
Right.
They require constant vigilance, a willingness to confront injustice, and a commitment to creating a society where all Americans have the opportunity to thrive.
It's a powerful reminder that the echoes of the Civil War reverberate through our history and continue to shape our present.
Absolutely. The Civil War was a defining chapter in American history, and its legacy continues to inform our national dialogue on issues of race, equality, and the meaning of freedom.
It's fascinating how a conflict that took place over 150 years ago continues to be so relevant to our lives today.
It speaks to the enduring power of history and its ability to shape our understanding of ourselves and the world around us.
Before we wrap up our deep dive into the Civil War, I want to shift gears a bit and talk about something that happened shortly after the war ended.
You mean Lincoln's assassination?
Exactly. It's such a tragic event, so close on the heels of this monumental victory. What do you think Lincoln's assassination tells us about the fragility of peace and the enduring wounds of conflict?
Lincoln's assassination, just days after Lee's surrender, it was a devastating blow to the nation. A stark reminder that, the wounds of war run deep and that peace, even when hard won, can be so fragile.
It's a chilling reminder that even in moments of triumph, shadows can linger. And it makes me think about the creation of the Secret Service. It was formed directly in response to Lincoln's assassination, wasn't it?
That's right, yeah. It highlights the nation's growing awareness of the need to protect its leaders and the realization that violence can erupt even amidst, calls for unity and healing.
It's a sobering thought for sure. It seems like the Civil War, even after it officially ended, continued to cast a long shadow over the nation. What do you think?
I agree. The war may have ended in 1865, but its consequences, both positive and negative, continued to shape the nation for generations to come. The legacy of slavery and its abolition, the question of states' rights versus federal power, the ongoing struggle for civil rights. These themes, they continue to resonate in American society today.
It's amazing how this one conflict continues to have such a profound impact on our understanding of ourselves as a nation. We've covered the battles and the strategies, the leaders and the movements, but it's the human stories, the political struggles, those enduring themes of freedom and equality that really stand out to me.
The Civil War wasn't just a clash of armies, right? It was a clash of ideas, a battle for the soul of a nation. It forced Americans to confront fundamental questions about their identity, their values, and the kind of future they wanted to build.
And those questions, in many ways, they still resonate with us today, don't they? We see echoes of the Civil War in contemporary debates about social justice, economic inequality, the meaning of freedom in a diverse and ever-changing society.
It's a reminder that history isn't just a collection of dusty facts and dates. It's a living, breathing narrative that shapes our understanding of the present and our hopes for the future.
It makes you think about the choices we make as individuals and as a society. Like, what lessons can we learn from the Civil War? How can we apply those lessons to the challenges we face today?
Those are important questions for all of us to consider. How can we bridge divides, promote understanding, and ensure that the sacrifices made during that era were not in vain? How can we create a society that truly lives up to the ideals of liberty and equality for all?
Well, I think the Civil War reminds us that unity is precious, and that division, when left unchecked, can have devastating consequences. It also reminds us that the fight for justice and equality is a continuous process, one that requires constant vigilance and a commitment to creating a more perfect union.
Well said. And I think it's important to remember that history is not just something we learn about. It's something we actively create. The choices we make today will shape the legacy of tomorrow.
That's a powerful thought. And it brings us back to you, our listener. We've explored a lot of ground in our deep dive into the Civil War. But what resonates most with you? What aspect of this conflict do you find most intriguing? What questions does it raise for you about our world today? We encourage you to continue exploring this pivotal chapter in American history. Delve deeper into the stories of those who lived through it, the decisions that shaped its course, and the enduring legacy that continues to influence our nation. Remember, history is not just a collection of names and dates. It's a tapestry woven from the threads of human experience. And it has much to teach us about ourselves, our world, and the possibilities for a better tomorrow.